welcome to RealAg Live, everybody. Thanks a lot for tuning in today. Hope you had yourselves a great weekend and you're off to a great start to this week as the weeks continue to absolutely fly by. Rough day in the markets today. I'm looking at the grain complex. There is not a single commodity that is in the green. Rough. Led by soybeans to the downside in the near month, down 23 and a quarter to 1168 and a half. So a rough day in the commodity markets today. But today we're talking China, not markets. It relates a little bit to the markets, especially with China being one of our biggest potential purchasers of agricultural commodities. If you want to ask our expert today a question, all you have to do is enter it in the comment box, whether you're watching on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, or Twitch, and we'll get to as many of the questions as we possibly can. I encourage you to participate in today's program. That's what makes RealAg Live such a cool thing. I'm going to bring in today's guest. It is Charles Burton. He is with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Charles, how are you doing?
It's good to see you again, Shaun.
Yeah, this is the first time we've been able to do a video chat. I've had you on RealAg Radio a couple times. I always appreciate your great insight on China. So thanks a lot for joining us here today.
Well, you look as good as you used to sound. I think I have more of a face for radio, but there we are.
Okay. Let's get to China. Now, I saw a piece you recently wrote, and it talked a lot about the fact that we've kind of got a bit of a change happening here in the sense, or an opportunity for change maybe, as it applies to the relationship with China. What do you think a Biden presidency will mean for the relationship between Canada and China?
Well, I think it's good news. Certainly we want to be able to work with our like-minded allies on addressing China's violations of the norms of trade and diplomacy. And so Mr. Biden would like to set up an alliance of democracies and come up with some coordinated action against China's asymmetrical bilateral economic coercion to further their political ends. So, you have a situation now with the downturn in relations between China and Australia, where China's imposed extremely high and unjustified tariffs on things like barley and other commodities like lobster and so on, threatening to do the same to wheat. Really, Australia doesn't have much recourse, but if all the nations of the world join together, then when China does something bad to one of us, all the rest of us could respond commensurately and disincentive the Chinese regime from punishing farmers to try and get their way politically in other areas. So, in the case of Australia, China listed about 14 things that they didn't like, such as their anti-political influence law, their funding of a research institute called the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, any number of things barring Chinese spies from coming into the country. They don't like how the Australian press reports on China. So they list all of these political issues, and then to pressure the government to somehow or other come to heel on it, they impose unjustified tariffs on commodity exports into the Chinese market. And of course, in the case of Australia, we're talking a huge dependence on the Chinese market for Australian grains and wine, much higher than ours, maybe by a factor of maybe as much as 10. If we're looking at 4% of our commodity exports going to China and most of the rest going to the United States, in the case of Australia, they're talking about 40% of their agricultural commodity exports that are dependent on the Chinese market at this time. So, you get Biden together. He recognized the United States as 25% of the global economy. He needs to work with allies. We might be able to come up with institutional response that would be more effective than the existing institutions like the WTO, which operate slowly and are hard to get any kind of good response out of. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we could see an end to this kind of Chinese economic coercion, and get them to stop doing things like barring our canola seeds on grounds that we don't think are justified.
Now, with this U.S. election, and some of it is just political speak and trying to rally people up.
Yeah.
But we hear from the both candidates in this election where one would say, oh, China or Russia doesn't want me to be elected, and kind of using that same sort of talk. Is there a specific candidate that you think China was actually hoping for? Was it President Trump or was it a President Biden?
I would say that they probably favored Trump. For one thing, Trump would have difficulty in rallying like-minded allies to a united approach to China's violations of the international rules-based order in trade and democracy, because nations of the world found it difficult to work with Mr. Trump because he was arbitrary and frankly often said things that were not true, and he seemed to have a considerable affection for dictators. The other thing is that Trump had a willingness to really violate the principles of fair and reciprocal trade by working side deals with the Chinese government and getting China to promise to source large quantities of agricultural commodities from the United States, which of course would give us a comparative disadvantage in that market. I think Biden is more likely a more internationalist figure who would be less inclined to do this kind of side dealing with China, and more inclined to think of the good of all in terms of respecting fair and reciprocal international norms to a much greater extent than we saw under Mr. Trump. But that being said, I think that the United States under Biden will be equally as concerned about China's unfair trade practices and violations of international law, then it's still going to be the same. In other words, the tensions between the United States and China will not be reduced by Biden, because we have serious concerns about China's expansionist policies in the South China Sea, China's genocidal policies against Turkic Muslims in the Northwest, and any number of other issues that China is engaged in that just are outrages against humanity. So I think that we'll work better with Biden. I think that if an institution is founded, coordinated by Biden, that Canada will have to get into compliance with those norms, and that will suggest a much more vigorous and stronger policy towards China, particularly China's violations of just sort of the accepted norms of trade and spurious violations of agricultural contracts that unfortunately Canada has seen over the past couple of years.
So, we are starting to hear whispers from U.S. farm groups about how, maybe the U.S. should think about getting back into the CPTPP, which was, something that the U.S. got out of very, very quickly. So, Lindsay has a point here, and I'm just going to put it up here. We are over and over hearing that not one country can really stand firm against China. Is a everyone but China organizational partnership the way to go, sort of this multilateral body, which was kind of the intent of the CPTPP, to try to keep China in line? And how do they do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Trans-Pacific Partnership would have been an excellent way to allow us to diversify our markets to nations that we can trust, and who have rule of law that would allow us to pursue violations of contracts, and would allow us to benefit from freer trade and the economic efficiencies that grow out of that.
Right.
I think it's difficult for Mr. Biden to go back into the TPP, simply because there's a perception, particularly in the U.S. industrial heartland, that these kinds of agreements lead to loss of jobs for ordinary industrial workers, because products can be produced more efficiently and cheaply in other members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So it's really unfortunate that Mr. Trump decided to leave that institution, but now that they're out, I think it could be politically quite challenging for Mr. Biden to get back in, but I live in hope. And I do think that, I think that we have to show China that we have viable alternatives to their market so that they have an incentive to play more by the rules of the game. Right now, I think China feels that they've got us in terms of our dependence on their market and the difficulties for us to diversify out of China in any easy way, and therefore are using this to pressure us politically. But I think that we have to demonstrate to the Chinese government that if they're not prepared to play by the rules, more or less the accepted norms, maybe not everybody plays exactly by the rules, but there's a sort of a space there that's acceptable, and China seems to operate outside of that space. That would induce them to stop with this. With this violation of contracts, and therefore we'd feel more confident in dealing with them in future, knowing that if we have a contract with them, that it will be respected fairly, and China won't come up with spurious grounds like claiming there's too much contaminants in our dockage or whatever, which is not true in the export. I think that this is the direction to go. And I think that we need to be working with the United States and other like-minded allies, and including not just the Europeans and the Anglosphere, but countries like India and Japan and South Korea, who have similar issues with China, and we should try and come up with some means to collaborate fairly. It only works, though, if everybody agrees to play to comply with the thing, and there's no outliers who do side deals with China to seeing an opportunity, and that's pretty hard to enforce. And within Canada, of course, there's a significant pro-China lobby who would probably like to play both sides of the street, collaborate with the United States in some kind of institutional mechanism to get China into compliance with the norms of international trade, but on the other hand, also, continue to do their business in China. These are the kind of people who say, well, the relationship is complicated or can't be black and white or whatever.
Right.
But I think in a lot of ways it's pretty simple, and there are some black and white elements that we should be standing by.
We're like a ping pong ball going back and forth as we try to navigate that relationship. Hey, question here from Brian. He's watching on Twitter. He says, could WTO reform via Ottawa Group include excluding countries that ignore international trade norms?
Well, I mean, that is, that would be great if we could, get say to China, well, you're not keeping with the spirit of the WTO. They may claim a lot of what they did under the participation of WTO, but I think what we really want is them to play fair and honest with us, to the extent that fairness and honesty is acted on by other countries. So one would like to see WTO reform. I mean, commensurately in the political area, you'd like to see United Nations reform. China's disruptive role on the Human Rights Council is, it's ridiculous that China is supposed to be on a UN agency that's supposed to be defending human rights when that country is clearly engaging in activities that are crimes against humanity and violations of human rights, or other areas where China is able to manipulate the United Nations to serve their interests, but which go against the spirit of these multilateral organizations, which is supposed to allow for fairness, reciprocity, and benefit to all, not be manipulated by one country that seeks to use those institutions to strengthen their own international position.
So how do you reconcile all this in your head and then try to provide a recommendation to people that are doing this, or trying to forge Canada's strategy? We've got really, really well-documented human rights violations in China, yet we're trying to do a lot of business with the country at the same time. We have obviously two Canadians, as referred to, the two Michaels illegally detained in the country. What is our end game, or what should be our solution, to try to rectify this? Because it just feels really, really messy. And I think for some of the people that throw out it's complicated,
I know sometimes I do that just to because I don't know what to say about it. It just it feels like it's really really messy.
Yes, I mean, I think that one aspect of it is the degree of Chinese influence in our business and political elite. And Australia has a Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act that demands that retired policymakers and senior civil servants register their income from foreign sources. So I think clearly, if in our policy process there are people who are expecting benefits from a foreign state if they, appease China, that sort of thing should, be stopped right away. And it's unfortunate that there's opposition within our government to modeling on the Australian legislation to make sure that when Canadian decisions are made, that they're made for Canadian purposes and not to serve the interests of another country. So, I would have liked to have seen us do more retaliation when China, for example, barred our agricultural commodity exports into China and the canola seeds and the meat and so on that's been going on. And, there are a number of things that I think we could have done. We could have restricted Chinese trade on the basis that, they're bringing fentanyl into our country. We could crack down on agents of influence and represent of the Chinese regime who are involved in menacing or harassing of Canadian citizens. I think we really need to do much more about cyber espionage, which also affects the agricultural sector, as some of their espionage is involved in looking at negotiations and seeing what the thinking is, so that they can come in with a bid that will be the best for them and as they understand it. There are just all sorts of areas where we could be doing more to say to that regime that you just can't do this. That there are consequences for hostage diplomacy. There are consequences for punishing our farmers to achieve your political purposes, and that Canada will respond. And so far we haven't. And with regard to other issues, like the South China Sea, like the Uyghurs and so on, we haven't done, or for that matter, Hong Kong. There are quite a number of people in Hong Kong who are under threat because of the Chinese enactment of the national security law. That really, I think we should be allowing to come to our country if they're under threat of persecution under a law that we regard as illegal under the agreement that China made with Britain at the time of the transfer of Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty. That we should, and we have taken many Hong Kong people, and before 97 we were bringing in 20,000-30,000 a year. So there are all sorts of areas in which Canada has been just sitting there. I think for a lot of people the expectation was that maybe if we can resolve the Meng Wanzhou issue, that everything can go back to normal and we could start to negotiate free trade again and see the benefits to at least certain elements of our elite from unfettered Chinese trade and investment. But I don't think that I don't think that that's coming back, for one thing, and I think for another thing that we're emboldening the Chinese to do more of this kind of economic coercion to achieve their political ends and the hostage diplomacy, because it seems to be working well for them. We haven't made a decision on Huawei, for example, which is pretty much a no-brainer because of our other allies have determined that putting the Huawei 5G in is a national security threat. But Canada is sitting on the decision. Maybe if the current government gets a majority in the next election, we'll see these things like Huawei happening, and other concessions to the Chinese regime, including which could include agreeing to Chinese state investment in our minerals and energy sector, and allowing Chinese labor to build oil pipelines from the oil sands to Tidewater and the BC coast, and so on and so on. And there are lots of things China wants. They'd like to expand up into port facilities in the Arctic and for strategic and trade purposes. All these things are open questions for Canada because we haven't told that regime where they stand with us.
Now, Canadians, I've seen a few surveys where showing that Canadian sentiment towards China is hardening.
Yeah.
Which may speak to why the Liberal government's been talking tough as of late, or at least a little bit tougher. Obviously, Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole is urging the government to take a harder stance on China as well.
Mhm.
What is driving that hardening stance? Is it been the U.S. policy and the fact that we get so much U.S. media, or is there something else at work?
Well, I think that it's true that our media has shown a lot of political interaction with China, which has caused the Canadian people to have a very negative impression of that regime. Of course, the arbitrary detainment and brutal incarceration of Michael Kovrig and Michael's Favor, which will soon be entering into its third year of prison hell for these completely innocent Canadian citizens, has played a lot into that. I think China's action on meat and canola is also, people look at that and say, what is this regime? And also the other violations of human rights, like the Uyghurs, it does have an impact. So what you've really got is a very wide gap between the perception of China on the part of our political and business elite, who want to do more with China and collaborate with China in many areas, including things like climate change, and the ordinary citizen, of whom something, I believe it's up to 86%, really don't like that place and feel that Canada should minimize our interaction with that regime to the extent possible. So we've got Mr. O'Toole there with a very with the China as being the key plank in his foreign policy agenda. The question really is, if the Conservatives did come into power, would they act on this? Because we've seen this before, where political parties have had a hard line on China, and then once they get into power, they adopt the policy essentially of their predecessor, which seems to involve a lot of concessions to China and benefits to business interests who have extensive contracts with mainland Chinese communist business networks inside China, and we just get the same stuff again. And unfortunately, those people don't seem to be really acting in the interests of your constituency, which is agriculture. Sorry to say, but I'm on your side.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I'm glad we got to have somebody on our side. Yesterday I was reading. It was a short essay in Foreign Affairs magazine. The author was talking about how the U.S.-China relationship is sort of sleepwalking into real conflict, and he compared it to the UK and Germany pre-World War I. It concerned me as I read it, because I was like, because we all know World War I was devastating for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
Is that a fair comparison?
It scares the hell out of me, and I think that a lot of it has to do with the current Chinese government, which it's the Chinese Communist Party, but clearly they're not interested in justice and economic benefit for ordinary people. It's you're looking at a party where their National People's Congress has 86 delegates who are billionaires in US dollar terms. So in terms of representing ordinary workers, peasants, and soldiers, as it was when I was a student there in the 70s, those days are gone. So their legitimacy comes from a promise to the people that China will rise to become the dominant power on the planet. They have what they call the community of the common destiny of mankind, which is a restructuring of global institutions to see China replacing the United States and the West as the people dominating political and economic affairs. And then they have their Belt and Road program, which is designed to restructure global infrastructure, ports and rail systems and highways and so on, to put China at the center and make the rest of us sort of economically subordinate. One of the complaints that China has against Australia has been Australia's refusal to join the Belt and Road program. So if China's not able to show that they're making progress to this audacious scheme, which, while it's a central plank of the current Communist Party Secretary Xi Jinping's political program, is, really enormously ambitious. I mean, the Belt and Road program, if those belts and roads were economically feasible, they'd probably have been done by private sector sources. So, they've run into a lot of problems and a lot of corruption and difficulties in realizing that. But if the regime is seen as being, brought to compliance with the existing rules-based order, then the legitimacy of the Xi regime starts to suffer, and they could lash out at us, and in that way, and it could lead to, as you say, a situation where we start to fall into an enormous global conflict, where you've got the Western nations ranked on one side, and China and a lot of other nations on the other. And we could see actual military clashes over the South China Sea or Taiwan or other aspects that would be disastrous for world peace. For one thing, it's likely that China would lose because they don't have the kind of military technology and might of the West. But even so, they might go into it as a just out of desperation as the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party starts to crumble. So I do worry about this. It is an awful nightmare to imagine that kind of return to from a Cold War to a hot war. And of course, if China had succeeded in getting the Huawei technology into our 5G, then that would allow them the capability of kill switches in critical Canadian infrastructure, or the ability to engage in cyber espionage and so on in the course of such an activity. So, Huawei would give the capability, but if the intent came up, then the threat would be huge. So I think that we cannot rule that out, and I really hope that there can be positive change within China that will allow that regime to get into compliance with the liberal norms that ensure justice and peace and fair economic distribution of wealth throughout the world. And if that happened, it could be wonderful for China, in terms of us having a trusting, highly engaged, productive relationship with that regime. But right now, we really can't trust them.
Yeah. Question here from Brian watching on Twitter. Japan has subsidized some firms to move out of China to Southeast Asia. Should Canada and the U.S. do the same?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think a lot of firms, they do regret going into China, because it often seems to be the case that the Chinese regime imposes arbitrary regulations that mean that their business is transferred to Chinese partners, or engages in demanding that if they wish to continue in their China operations, that they have to hand over proprietary manufacturing processes or intellectual property. So, a lot of them, I think, would like to move out. I haven't heard pressure from Canadian firms in China to for government subsidy to facilitate the transfer of their operations to other countries where they can operate without this other issue of too much state intervention and arbitrary imposition of taxes and so on. I would say that in back, I think it was about 2013 or so, under the Harper government, we did ratify the foreign investment promotion agreement, promotion and protection agreement with China. But so far, I haven't seen any Canadian businesses in China who've been able to successfully use that agreement to get a fair shake if they feel that the contracts that they had in China have not been respected. So, I could see why there would be interest in deciding that, the Chinese environment is just too difficult to deal with, and to protect their business, they should leave. Unfortunately, a lot of Canadian businesses, once they transfer out to China, lose everything, and it's a story that repeats over and over again. But it's not one that they like to publicize. So I think there's a lot more of that going on than we're aware of.
Another question here from Lindsay: is it even possible to fully diversify away from business with China? Is that even in Canada's best interests?
Well, I agree. It's a huge market. The thing is that due to their extensive use of non-tariff barriers and other means, as I said, we're only sending 4% to that enormous country. So it's more about potential and promise.
Yeah.
And I think that the people who defend China's interests and want Canada to comply with China's requests, like we should have an extradition treaty or something like that, things that we just can't possibly do, or arbitrarily release Meng Wanzhou, which would be, an interference in our independence of judiciary, that they promise that great riches will accrue to Canada. And I'm old enough to remember 3 times when there have been senior leaders from China who have promised that our trade would be doubled within 5 years. And that's never happened. Our share of the Chinese market has been stable or reducing. So the cost of Canada diversifying away from China is, in the larger picture of our economy, is not that great. So I think that, we should, of course, do business with China to the extent possible, but I don't think we ought to do business with them unless they're prepared to do it on terms which are reciprocal and fair. And if we have to make a lot of compromises to get that business with China, I don't think we ought to do that. Our Canadian values and our commitment to multilateralism and internationalism is such that we'd lose an awful lot if we complied with everything the Chinese regime would like out of us.
Yeah. I'll wrap up with this. We've seen in the last 3-4 years, both China and the U.S. sort of use Canada as a chess piece in trying to increase leverage on the other. How do we find sovereignty in trying to navigate these waters between these two superpowers?
I think that's a very important question. I think that, really we want to be strengthening the WTO and the UN, as one of your earlier listeners suggested. And, that would be the ideal way. But at present, it seems the only way for us to come up with a means to address China is under U.S. leadership. And that really wasn't possible under President Trump, even though Secretary of State Pompeo did talk about it an awful lot. Particularly, they seem to be keener on Europe, although I thought that, they really weren't paying enough attention to Canada. But I think under President Biden, we could see that. But, it's always the case that nations act in their own self-interest, and China and the U.S. are superpowers. And so I think it's critical that we collaborate more closely with other middle powers, like in Europe and Australia and New Zealand, to try and protect the interests of the existing international order, which is really the only way for us to maintain our Canadian interests in an increasingly hostile and unfair world.
Well, Charles, I really appreciate you joining us here. This has been so informative. I love your expertise and perspective on this China issue. I always enjoy your writing, and you always are so gracious with your time. Whenever I email or call, you always oblige, and I appreciate it very, very greatly.
It's a great pleasure for me to speak with you, Shaun, and I'm grateful to your listeners for their questions, and I hope we can talk again soon.
For sure. Great stuff. Okay, thanks a lot, everybody, for tuning in today to RealAg Live. Great information there from Charles Burton of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute on China. Of course, you can, if you want to hear it again, you can find it at realagriculture.com. RealAg.com/live. That's where the archive always rests. Hey, make sure you tune in to RealAg Radio today on Rural Radio 147. We are going to have Agronomic Monday. We got a lot of great discussions there focused on agronomic issues across the country. Thanks, everybody, for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Live, and we'll chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everyone.